Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining in today's Lunch and Learn session from the Railway Civil Engineers Association. My name is Jen Lee Chu, and I'm the newly elected chair of the RCEA committee, and I will be starting off the slides before handing over to our speakers. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is myself. Yeah, this event will be an online event only. We will be recording the event and then uploading the recording onto our YouTube page. This will then be distributed in an email to all the attendees, along with the slides from the speakers. And today's meeting covers the subject of biodiversity net gain for rail projects. Next slide, please. So to introduce ourselves, the RCEA was founded in 1921, and we exist to encourage the exchange of knowledge and experience between railway civil engineers. In 1997, we became part of the Institution of Civil Engineers as a specialist knowledge society. We currently have over 470 members, and we do events, which are evening lectures and also our lunch and learn lectures. And we're having 16 events this year and counting. Next slide, please. If you are interested in joining the RCEA as a member, please note that our membership fees are quite affordable. It's £18.50 a year for ordinary members, £8.75 a year for young members, and £5.50 a year for retired members, and free for students and graduates. And what I will also say is that these fees are going to be rising very modestly in the year 2026. Next slide, please. If you are interested in getting involved in the RCEA, our next committee meeting is on Tuesday, the 27th of May at 5 p.m. online, which will last for up to an hour. If you're interested, please email the RCEA at ice.org.uk for further details, and we would love to have you take part. Next slide, please. For our future events, we're having an afternoon lecture on the 22nd of May, online only, on the Huddersfield Station project as part of Transpennine Wood Upgrade. Then for the afternoon of Monday, the 9th of June, we'll have a lunch and learn on lessons learned from the building of Headboat Lane Station by Tom Heighton, another RCA committee member. And at the end of June, on Thursday, the 26th of June, from 6 to 7:30 p.m., we will be having a presentation on the Colindale Underground Station project, which will be online and in person at 1 Great George Street. This is a project that I'm personally involved in, and it will be presented by the contractor's project manager, the lead designer's engineer, as well as the project engineer from LU. And without further ado, I hand you over to Debbie Bewley to present on biodiversity net gain.
Hello everyone, welcome to this session on biodiversity net gain for rail projects. My name is Debbie Bewley and I'm the Aegis UK Head of ESG, Environmental and Social Governance. I've been working in sustainability for over 25 years now, and I've worked on many rail projects, including Thameslink and the Midland Main Line electrification projects. I'm very involved in I was very involved in the early trials of BNG actually on Thameslink just over 10 years ago. So I'm very excited to be here today to explore BNG with you in more detail. In a moment, I'm going to talk through our agenda and the plan for this session. But firstly, I'll hand over to my colleague Isabella to introduce herself.
Thank you, Debbie. Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. My name is Isabella Pwan. I am the head of landscape at WW+P, an architectural firm part of the Aegis family. We work with transport, and probably know some of you, and many of you will hopefully know WW+P as well. Through landscape, we work with BNG almost every day. So we are quite well suited to show some of the case studies that we worked on, and hopefully try to give you a little bit more of a hands-on for biodiversity net gain with rail projects as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabella. So our agenda for today, in a moment, we're going to give you a very quick intro to Aegis and WW+P. And we've prepared some slides today, but we really want to include your thoughts and what you want to take away from the session. So in a moment, we're going to capture your thoughts using an application called Mentimeter. Some of you may be familiar, but we'll talk you through if you're not. And then we're going to go through, importantly, the focus on why BNG is important, why we're doing this in the UK, and why the need for a mandatory approach has been introduced. I'll then take you through a very high-level overview of what BNG is and what it means for rail projects. And then Isabella is going to bring Biodiversity Net Gain to life with a series of rail project case studies. We've included 2 opportunities for Q&A in our session, as we're really keen to hear from you. There's one midway through the session and then one at the end. Unfortunately, the QA function wasn't set up when this live event was published, so we're not going to be able to use that function in Teams in the live event, but we will be capturing your questions using Mentimeter, and Isabella will explain more on that in a moment. So keep that Mentimeter app open once you have it open in the background through our session. So first, very quickly, introduction to Aegis and WW+P. We are an international engineering, consulting and infrastructure operating company. We work across multiple sectors, including transportation, and we specialise in rail, providing a wide range of services that span the entire life cycle of rail assets, including consultancy through to design and project implementation. And as Isabella explained, she's part of WW+P, who are the architectural line within Aegis. So I'll just hand over to Isabella to explain a bit more about WW+P.
As you say, in short, WW+P is very well known for their transport schemes. We have obviously worked on the Elizabeth line with a few of the stations there, London Bridge as well. We are involved also in HS2 and even in East West Rail. So we are an architectural firm focusing mostly on the architectural part of it, but that doesn't mean that we don't bring in the public realm, and hence my role working on the landscape on implementing these stations and mobility structures.
Thanks, Isabel. So yes, looking forward to you sharing your case studies later in our session. So at Aegis UK, we have a sustainability strategy with 3 core pillars. One of those is caring for our planet, which includes our commitments to protecting nature in how we operate. We're members of the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum, and we have signed up to the UK Nature Positive Business Pledge to really enforce our commitment to biodiversity protection through not only how we operate, but also through the projects that we support our clients with. So going to hand over to Isabella now to capture your thoughts and some important aspects of what you want to take away from the session today. Over to you, Isabella.
Yeah, I think if we can just go to the next slide.
There we go.
There we go. Yeah, so I can introduce this. So if you can all log on to menti.com, you can either use the QR code if you're on your phone, or you can use the actual code on the right-hand side. Do shout if there's a possibility for that, if you're having issues. So what I'll do is I'll slowly flip over to Menti. You will see the same code coming up also there when I shift. So don't worry if you weren't able to catch it in time. Here we go. Yeah, so you can see the code up here at the top as well. So please use that to log in as well. So what we will be doing in the next question here is that we will just be asking you a little bit about what comes to mind when you think of biodiversity and BNG. just in is a sort of feeler to see where you're at, and how we can also structure the further presentation based on your comments here. So I'll just wait a moment for you to have a chance to write some responses. Great, we're getting some responses in. Great, protecting our environment, very good. Green spaces, blue-green roof, biodiversity, yeah. Introducing new habitats as part of infrastructure projects. Beautiful plants that makes us feel good, yeah, that's also a very good one. And we got even more here, promoting biodiversity and more species on projects. Okay, all a really good sort of holistic approach to biodiversity and even biodiversity net gain. They should, yeah, ensures development, leave habitats in a better state, rich and diverse wild and plant life, yeah. Vegetation, trees, plants, insect, hotels and ponds. Rewilding, oh, this is brilliant. Very good. And you know, all of these things are really great. And I think what Debbie will also touch upon a little bit later is all of this also obviously has a clear direct impact on us and human life as well. And that's why we are obviously also thinking about this, because it in the end has an impact for us. Next question will be, what are you hoping to take away from today's session? So this is really your opportunity as a sort of mini first Q&A for you to put in something, so you can also direct us to make sure we answer some of the questions you may have had for Biodiversity Net Gain. So please feel free to open up on that. Yeah, great. What we can do, yeah, that's a good start. See if there's going to be a few more questions, a few more points coming through. Gain knowledge of what we can do within projects. Yeah, fantastic. Understanding what projects need to do to with biodiversity net gain, cost-effective strategies. Consolidating on what we learned about it last year. Okay, great. Yeah, so there's already some initial learning. Good. Innovative ideas and good practice. Understanding how to consider biodiversity in project where this isn't a client's priority. Yeah. Understanding of what we can do on a day-to-day smaller projects. These are all fantastic. So we're going to try, obviously, and do our best to try and encompass all of these things. It will be sort of a initial pass at Biodiversity Net Gain, but hopefully we'll give you a sort of a framework that you can work with and some first steps to understand how to really approach it, how to get it through in a most efficient way, and some of the challenges that you may also see within this. So I will give it back to you, Debbie. So hopefully you can at least give us the initial introduction.
Great, thanks, Isabella. Okay. So some of you in your thoughts have already touched upon why biodiversity net gain is so important. I mean, it represents a really significant shift in how development impacts the natural environment in the UK. And by mandating a net positive outcome for biodiversity, it's hoped that it will address biodiversity loss and enhance the resilience of ecosystems. And somebody actually put resilience of ecosystems in their thoughts there, which I thought was brilliant. So to highlight why it's so important, I'm going to hand over to the legend that is David Attenborough in a short video which he made to launch the UK campaign Save Our Wild Isles 2 years ago. So bear with me one moment. And we will hear from David on why Biodiversity Net Gain, and a few other famous faces in there also.
In my lifetime, wildlife in Britain and Ireland has seen devastating declines.
The reality is that actually we're one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world.
Nature underpins everything that makes our lives possible.
The food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe.
If we are to save what we have left, we must act now. Whether you're an individual, a community, a business leader, or a politician,
We need hands on deck.
Everyone, everywhere can do something to help restore nature.
Nature is yours, nature is everybody's.
this starts and ends with us.
So we tend to think of biodiversity loss as being a problem for countries the other side of the world. However, as highlighted in the video, the UK is in fact one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. We're actually in the bottom 10%. In the UK, we've seen an average decline of biodiversity by 19% since 1970. So this is one of the reasons it's extremely important. As also explained in the video, ultimately we need to protect biodiversity to protect us, to protect people. We cannot survive without it. In a nutshell, it is biodiversity that sustains us. In addition to providing essential ecosystem services like food production, water purification and climate regulation, we know that nature is really important for our mental health and well-being, and this is backed up by scientific studies. I think we can all remember during the pandemic how important a walk in nature was, or a dose of vitamin N, vitamin nature, as I like to call it. So we really need to start thinking of the valuable services that nature provides us, like we would a valuable capital asset. And that's why Biodiversity Net Gain is so important. So some of you clearly have been are aware of what Biodiversity Net Gain, but there might be some people who are not really aware of what it is. So we're going to start quite simply by explaining what it is. And I think actually somebody in their thoughts already explained it quite nicely. It is simply an approach to development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than before. It is recognised that new development and the construction industry in general in the UK have had a significant impact on our ecosystems, and this has contributed to significant biodiversity loss. But BNG isn't just about replacing what's lost. It actually requires creating or improving habitats so that there is at least a 10% net gain. And essentially, if done correctly, the aim is that BNG will begin to reverse the trend of biodiversity loss we have in the UK. So BNG became a mandatory legal requirement in England for most developments in early 2024. Now there are at the moment certain exemptions, including developments that don't require planning permission under permitted development, but it's important to highlight that organisations such as Network Rail and TfL, they've set their own targets to protect and enhance biodiversity, and that includes projects that fall under permitted development rights. Nationally significant infrastructure projects, NISPs, are exempt, but just for now, because the government intends to introduce BNG for NISPs, including major rail projects, in either late 2025 or early 2026, and this is currently subject to further consultation. So there are some differences in Wales and Scotland. In Wales, BNG is known as net biodiversity, net benefit for biodiversity. And whilst it doesn't fall under the same legislation as in England, it is in Wales a mandatory requirement that's implemented through planning policy. In Scotland, it's different. While it's not a mandatory requirement, planning policy in Scotland does encourage and promote biodiversity gain, and it's thought that Scotland will be very soon implementing some more mandatory requirements around biodiversity net gain. So our session today focuses on the legal requirement for BNG in England, where this legal requirement is enforced through the Environment Act and the Town and Country Planning Act. It's delivered through national planning policy and Section 106 agreements and enforced by local authorities. Oh, excuse me, flipped on too fast there. So how is BNG calculated? Well, essentially, it's a process of biodiversity accounting. A proxy biodiversity score of a development site is calculated in terms of habitat units, and this is based on the extent, condition and type of habitats that are present on the development site. Habitat distinctiveness is a specific classification used in the process to indicate the relative value of a habitat type, and it helps determine how important or irreplaceable a habitat is from a biodiversity perspective, and this directly affects how many units a habitat is worth. So, for example, scrub-based disturbed ground along ballast margins would be classified as low distinctiveness, whereas established tree cover would be classed as high. So the actual calculation is done now using the specific statutory biodiversity metric and tool developed and owned by DEFRA in collaboration with the government body Natural England. Important to highlight that the tool, the user guide and the habitat assessment criteria are all actually statutory instruments under the legislation and must be followed. So for the actual accounting process, the BNG accounting process, it's quite simple. The development site is scored and is calculated pre-construction to give the baseline in terms of habitat units that actually exist on the site pre-development. The score is then calculated again based on plans for habitat remaining post-construction. And to achieve net gain, the development must have a final unit score 10% higher than the baseline. So the principle of the accounting is pretty straightforward, but it is more complicated because there is a technical assessment of the habitat types. The assessment and calculation needs to be completed by a trained, competent person working with the designers and landscape architects and project management team. And importantly, local authorities require that the BNG calculation is signed off by a competent ecologist. It's also really important to highlight that biodiversity net gain is not carte blanche to destroy habitat on a development site and then compensate for this loss somewhere else. The legislation mandates the application of the mitigation hierarchy that you see here to look firstly at avoiding, minimising and restoring habitat on the development site wherever possible prior to compensating for biodiversity losses off-site. Compensation off-site can only be adopted after this process has been followed. So what does biodiversity net gain mean for rail projects? If a project does fall under the legal BNG requirements, the implications can be very significant. So early integration into the project lifecycle is crucial. It can't be an afterthought. It needs to be baked in from the feasibility stage. And this will hopefully help to make it a win-win, getting the best outcome for both nature and for the project, helping to keep it practical and deliverable for the project. It's easier, it is obviously easier and more cost effective to look at protecting biodiversity from the outset of the project. Having a clear early understanding of the project site and its biodiversity value will ensure a project understands the implications for actually achieving BNG early. It's also vital, obviously, therefore, to ensure that BNG is incorporated into the early design and throughout the design development, the project management and budget considerations of a project early, as depending on the complexity and scale of the project and the actual site itself, and the existing biodiversity baseline, it could be a time-consuming and costly process. If BNG cannot be achieved on site and a project has to look off-site, then the project will need to buy BNG units or buy BNG credits, and that might be an expensive and complicated process also. We'll explain more about those options in a moment. Importantly, to achieve planning approval for sites that require BNG, a habitat management and monitoring plan is required that must be in place for 30 years, and this is a legal agreement. The plan basically must outline habitat types created or enhanced, management actions to achieve and retain the net gain, monitoring strategies for that net gain, responsibilities for implementation and funding, so detailed management plan. And this is required for all BNG units, whether they're delivered on-site or off-site. And Natural England provides guidance and templates for these plans on their website. So let's look a little bit more at options for obtaining biodiversity net gain. So on-site first, as I previously mentioned, to obtain BNG units, the mitigation hierarchy must be followed first, and that's a focus on what can be done on your development project site first. And through, I think, clever design and a focus on avoiding, minimising or restoring habitat loss on site where possible, will hopefully minimise the need for obtaining units off-site. So, for example, enhancing existing railway embankments with native species could increase your BNG units on site, and also this could be more cost effective. Also, achieving BNG on site can be much easier in the planning approval process. And local planning authorities do prefer on-site delivery for transparency and, importantly, for local benefits. On-site biodiversity net gain can also be used to achieve integrated project outcomes and co-benefits for the project. So, for example, it can be combined with flood mitigation and climate change resilience. It can be combined with landscape design and public realm improvements. And importantly, local biodiversity improvements are obviously much more visible and appreciated by the local community. However, implementing BNG on site for rail infrastructure projects can have several challenges, given the complex and linear nature of rail developments. As we know, rail sites are often constrained by space, leaving limited areas for meaningful habitat creation. Also, BNG units, as I explained a moment ago, must be maintained through a management plan for at least 30 years. And so this can be difficult to guarantee in operational rail environments. Can also be complicated by changing land use, access restrictions associated with rail environments, or even funding shifts over time. So those are important considerations. If BNG is not possible on a rail site, then there are two options off-site. One, looking at existing rail land portfolio elsewhere. The habitat units must be registered, or these off-site habitat units must be registered on the official BNG registered database maintained by Natural England. And then also, importantly, there may be challenges around geographical locations, as local authorities prefer BNG units to be within their boundaries. So this may limit options for use of existing land portfolio associated with rail projects. So the other option available is to purchase habitat units off-site, or purchase statutory biodiversity net gain credits. So local authorities have land available to purchase via local habitat creation schemes, and also habitat units are available to buy from habitat banks set up on the private market, and average prices on the private market have been sort of estimated as of January this year, about £30,000 per unit, but costs can vary considerably depending on a number of factors, and obviously also market conditions and the location. The government has also set up the statutory biodiversity net gain credit scheme. However, this should be seen as the very last resort. These credits have been priced very high to actually encourage on-site or more local biodiversity net gain solutions. In fact, the prices of these can range from 42,000 to 65,000 per unit. And I know Isabel will be using this in a case study in a moment. So whilst on-site BNG should be the first focus, off-site does have some positives. It's obviously required if there's no option on site. It's scalable. It's much easier for large projects needing lots of units, so it's scalable for large scale projects. Off-site means also the habitat management and monitoring plan is managed and delivered by third parties, but you must ensure that happens. That's a legal agreement. But as discussed, the disadvantages to off-site BNG are extensive, very expensive. Off-site's more penalised within the metric, the accounting process, so you need more. It adds to planning approval complexity, and there's clearly weaker community benefit. So I'm just going to finish quickly on a recap on some of the key challenges around the BNG agenda, but also the opportunities, because it's very new and it's a fundamental change for development projects. So there are lots of challenges which are being recognised and things happening to resolve them also. It can be complicated. Some of the details are still evolving. There is a low level of awareness of the requirements in our industry, and that makes it a steep learning curve. The lack of space we've already touched upon. So the reality is rail projects will face challenges in delivering on-site habitat gains, but a lot can be done through clever design. There is there is a shortage of ecologists out there to help with the BNG assessments and provide practical advice. And the reality is that projects will need the support of specialist expertise to deliver practical biodiversity net gain for their sites. Unfortunately, there's also a shortage of resources in local planning authorities. And given that they will need to approve BNG plans and that agreeing solutions is likely to require some negotiation with local planning authority officers, it could mean delays in planning approvals. All of these challenges make it even more important that projects consider the implications for BNG as early as possible. So the opportunity early consideration will make it much easier to deliver. If it's left later in the project planning, it becomes much more difficult to achieve. Obviously, as discussed right at the beginning, the aim is of BNG is to reverse decline of nature in the UK, and the rail industry has a massive opportunity to play in this. Another big opportunity that I touched on earlier was the co-benefits, that BNG can help to support around human health and well-being and building in climate resilience, for example, flood protection, which, given the serious impacts of floods on rail infrastructure that we know are increasing, this actually can result in significant cost savings longer term. So in a moment, Isabella's going to bring BNG to life through a series of rail project case studies. But before that, we'd like to open up the Mentimeter app again to capture any questions that you may have at this stage.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. I'm just gonna switch over so you can see the code again. And we can present that in case you had dropped off. We are gonna just jump into the next one, which is the midway Q&A. So we'll just give you a few moments to see if there's any questions, and if not, we'll obviously continue. And remember, there's another option for Q&A afterwards in the very end of the presentation.
Can you share your screen, please?
Oh,
I'm not
yes.
seeing it.
Sorry, did not get to click on that one. There we go.
It may be, Isabella, that will there'll be more questions with your after your case studies, because you're going to go into much more.
It does look like it. So let me just jump back to
a thumbs up there for somebody.
Let's jump back to the presentation here, and we'll take it on from the case studies here. Okay, so I'll take you through some of the projects that we've done. Not all of them are rail oriented, but it's also just to give you a more variety of understanding of what kind of challenges you may come across in different projects. So the first one here was actually a rail associated project. It was a master plan, a very early concept master plan with a new station coming into a quite industrial site. And with that, we were looking into expanding sort of commercial opportunity, industrial community associated with the rail tracks. So there was, it was actually a Network Rail derelict site. So one of our biggest concerns here was that there was a lot of vegetation that had sort of grown wild, and you might not think that that has a lot of biodiversity, but that actually has quite a high distinctiveness, even if you call it sparsely vegetated land, and the condition of it was moderate, which you will see over in the table on the right here. You can see the colors also that should define the different types. You end up actually with a lot of habitat units that you have to in some way maintain or re-establish or enhance depending on your design that you're coming up with. So on the baseline calculations that we were doing, we were having already a habitat unit with 10% target. We would need to actually provide a 13.46 habitat units if we were to take all of this away. And when you do your baseline, you also have to project how much you're going to keep. So you can see here there's a table that's called area retained or enhanced. So in some way it will also keep in mind the habitat you're keeping or maintaining even with your new proposal. So that helps you a little bit with the habitat units. So what we did, because it was such early days and it's a concept master plan, we gave it a range of where we would probably end up with the habitat units, depending on whether we would take more of the existing baseline. And obviously we could see that we would already have quite a lot of trouble. 13 doesn't necessarily sound like much, but when you're developing a biodiversity net gain proposal, every habitat unit, you really in some way have to fight for it if you don't have any sort of baseline that you can take from, or any sort of high level habitat that you already have on site. So we were looking into already from the very early stage of offsite mitigation in close proximity to our red line boundary, but which could potentially support us in providing these 13.46 habitat units. And obviously this is a conversation with your client, and this is really where that communication is extremely important, because you also showcase to them that, you know, we might not be able to do this on site, but there are opportunities in the local areas, which means that you potentially could refrain from having to buy any sorts of credits or from the habitat banks as well. So then we looked into a future projection towards how the master plan would develop, how much landscape and how much habitat could we actually implement within this proposal and within this project, and to understand how much the deficit would be, to give the client a better understanding, obviously, of where we're at with this proposal. And the proposal is very much looking at obviously using also the existing kind of type of planting, but keeping it quite realistic to, if you were to develop this for industrial development, you most likely would not end up having a lot of sort of vegetated area or woodland, or in any way a sort of larger wetland areas. What we did look into was more sort of urban proposals like rain garden. And when you do start to look into more urban nature or vegetation, you will see that it becomes very, very hard to get the habitat units. With Biodiversity Net Gain, we're really looking at enhancing natural habitats such as other natural grasslands, meadows, woodland, wetlands, all sorts of in that direction. But we also do know that in our urban areas, this may be quite difficult to achieve in certain areas where we have also a development quantum. So what we really looked at was biodiversity, that biodiverse green roof and bioswales. They have a little bit higher sort of habitat unit, achieving a little bit higher habitat unit. So we were really trying to max this out. So even with the maxed out situation, you can see here on the right hand side that we were only able to really achieve 9.47, which meant that we still had almost 3 habitat units deficit. And again, you know, looking at the offsite mitigation, we would actually be able to develop something quite significant, at least with this large one, that even just that large one, if we were to do mixed scrub, we would actually already get up to our 10% net gain. So there was something to at least, you know, talk to the client about of where they would like to go with this, and keeping in mind that this would have to be maintained 30 years down the line. With this project, having several developers and potentially several clients within one site, it could become very tricky to make sure that maintenance is upheld. So there was also something to discuss with the council and the client in that manner. At the same time with this project, we were actually looking into 2 other plots here as well, and we defined at the end that looking at them as one big plot for biodiversity net gain may be much more successful for us, because we could mitigate the habitat units over a larger area and tie into more interesting existing habitats around, because we actually did have some water on the side here also. So when we then sort of put that into cost, we were trying to paint a picture, obviously also to the client, that the client was trying to sort of think about what could we do if we can't promote this on site or locally even. So we were obviously following the mitigation hierarchy, we were showcasing also the client that if you were to go with the statutory credits, you would end up in a cost around 115,000 to 200,000 just on the basis of a deficit of only 3 habitat units. So you can see how influential it is to really make sure that your design can work as hard as possible, even in the early phases. But what the early phases does is it really paints your picture of where you need to move towards with your design, and it can really sort of start defining also your optioneering, which I'll show in the next case study. And that will come a little bit later. First, I wanted to discuss a little bit and build upon what Debbie was saying with the distinctiveness. So the distinctiveness really is key, because what comes with the distinctiveness is the Biodiversity Net Gain trading rules, and they are typically the ones that make your project fail or succeed. So you may have made a fantastic scheme, super green, full of biodiversity everywhere. But if you do not adhere to the trading rules, it will still come up as non-compliant. So what a trading rule really means is that if, for example, you, as we do in this project, this is a metro project, the BLE, the Bakerloo line that we worked on a little bit. If you look at this, it will highlight in your calculation sheets that what you had in your baseline also needs to reflect itself in your proposal. So in our baseline, we had sort of an area that was for individual trees, and not all of it has been accommodated for in the proposals. That's literally what this orange box is saying, that actually your proposal is missing 0.12 square meters or hectares, sorry, square hectares to accommodate these trading rules. What it can also mean is that it can show you that you've actually not provided the right type of habitat that you need to accommodate for the trading rules. So here, for example, it's saying that in the original scheme we had introduced shrub, but we don't have anything of that character in our proposal. We don't have any sorts of shrubs available. We've only proposed for other neutral grasslands, and hence it will come up as a flagging that you have not necessarily been compliant with your biodiversity net gain. And when talking to a lot of my colleagues and a lot of other ecologists, they all come back and say that it's the trading rules that really catches you in the end. No matter how ambitious you might have been, you still have to be very careful about what kind of habitats are you actually bringing into the proposal, which in itself makes good sense, because you know that with a certain habitat in your baseline, you have a certain palette of species, insects, wildlife, and in some way what Biodiversity Net Gain wants to ensure is that you are accommodating for the same type of species and more. So it's really about making sure that we're not necessarily removing wildlife, insects, and the habitats that are already there, but we're gaining and we're establishing at least the minimum, again, plus 10%. And so if we go to the next one, so this one is really one of the projects where we work with Biodiversity Net Gain to direct our optioneering. So this is a large car park in an airport space, and actually it had really high quality habitats already existing in your baseline, which meant that touching anything in some way had was costly for the Biodiversity Net Gain. And so what we really looked at was 2 different layouts to try and see if there was one that would be more accommodating towards a biodiversity net gain than the other. And on your left-hand side, you'll see that all of the car park has been accommodated on the left-hand side of the whole site. And by doing that, it's on top of both other natural grasslands, but also some quite high distinctive and high quality wild growing native shrubs and scrub as well. So all in all, based on this, we could see that we ended up with a habitat unit deficit of 53.52. Now remember, the other one was only 13. Here we're talking 53, so it's quite a scale upwards here, and we could see that it would be very tricky for the client to be able to actually bring that back into a proposal. But we outlined certain areas where we could see that potentially we could move some of the car park to already hardscaped areas instead of actually taking out more of the greenery. So in option 2 in layout B, you can see that we actually kept as much as possible free down at the lower part of the left-hand side here. And we also put in a proposal to actually enhance the existing scrub to try and get some additional habitat units into that. We were sadly only able to move small parts of the car parking, and the client wasn't really keen on us using some of certain areas of the hardscape. So we still had to take out some of the other neutral grassland, which meant that actually we did some. We only saved 3 habitat units. But this is an important sort of strategy and an important process to go through, because you might actually be able to optimize your design based on a focus on biodiversity net gain, not just efficiency of the development that you need to put into your project. Then obviously the route wide, which we know very well from rail projects, is a very, very tricky situation, especially because you cut through different habitats, different natural settings, different council boundaries and boroughs. So, it's all a massive, massive puzzle that you need to look into. And hence it becomes crucial that every sort of sub-site that you work with works its very hardest to maintain the baseline and as Debbie mentioned earlier, use a mitigation hierarchy to first and foremost have a don't touch kind of approach to it, and then start to work with where you can actually optimize. For rail, it obviously is much more trickier to provide high quality habitats such as woodland or wetlands. That really comes when we work with viaducts, for example, or over bridges. And then we can start looking into certain areas like that. But most of the time it will really just be the embankments and the edges around the rail. And here you're obviously also dependent on height of tree or a tree falling on the rail. So you would work with other natural grassland, which is probably one of the most used type of habitat here. And then it's really what you can do when you start to extend outwards from your rail tracks that really has an impact. But it is a large puzzle to put it all together. Most likely what we see is you do individual calculations on BNG for the subplots, and then you start to pull it together all as a one connected one. But it will go through many, many iterations, because every time you change something just a little bit in one end, it will have an impact on the full calculation. But there is the option to also do subplot calculations with BNG and take them as almost individual projects, which can be, a benefit sometimes. Yeah, so if we're to just catch up on that a little bit, some key takeaways or just follow-ups on what we've discussed is, as Debbie also mentioned, early consideration. I can't state that enough. It is extremely crucial that you have an understanding of what you're working with before you start doing anything with your project. If we've already developed a proposal, we've gotten far down to schematic design, and we suddenly do biodiversity net gain, you most often would see that you would have to go back to the drawing board, or it becomes a very, very costly solution for your client in the end. Obviously, keep in mind the 10% gain, but also keep in mind that that is a minimum. We want to obviously try to achieve more, and it should really be our aspirations to go further than the 10%. So we use obviously the GOVS metric that Debbie also presented as our key sort of evaluator to understand the rules and of engagement with that. And then, as I said, keep in mind the trading rules. These are really, really crucial for you to actually get a compliant scheme out in the end. And yeah, design to gain. So as designers and as engineers as well, we can only really estimate and we can only really do our very best when we are designing, that we keep in mind how we influence and impact. But in the end, ecologists are the responsible parties for the final sign-up. But landscape architects, designers, and also engineers, we can obviously help to prepare the client. And from my point of view, working with the engineers of understanding the conditions and the optioneering helps us also to be able to design better for biodiversity net gain. And just a little bit of an extra little note outside of biodiversity net gain, focusing more on biodiversity. You know, we really need to just in general change a little bit our approach to design and focus a bit more on sensibility towards nature and promote this coexistence. So what we also do as landscape architects and something we do at WW+P is that we look at a form of landscape version of BIM. And the landscape information modeling, where we implement all the data that we have from ecosystem services and benefits from natures and how that affects your design. So really thinking about designing with its fullest. So what we look at growth patterns and microclimate enhancement, even mental health improvements also. Really looking at, you can actually even use nature within your carbon calculations and your carbon footprint, and utilize it even for yearly avoided runoff. As Debbie also said, this co-benefit that comes out of actually designing with nature. So in general, when we design against environmental challenges, it is crucial to work to collaborate between disciplines, between nature and disciplines, and even incorporating and utilizing technology that we have available, because it can really help us understand. With the LIM models, for example, it simulates also the biodiversity net gain and how we can improve our design based on what we need for biodiversity net gain. So a little summary before we go into the final Q&A. Main takeaways from today's session. I hope obviously we've given you just a little bit of a taster of what biodiversity net gain can also look like in reality. But considerations is early involvement in process, and have this really collaborative approach, which in some way comes with bringing something in very early, you know, working between designers, engineers and ecologists, and even with the client as well is key for getting a successful biodiversity net gain scheme out. And then, you know, really understand your baseline, because the baseline will in some way give you the key to your options and your further development of the proposal. So for the engineers, I would say the real impact of BNG is really how your design actually may, like how you consider the impact that the design that you are developing, how that may have an impact on the BNG, and really think about optioneering. Consider alternatives of how we can potentially protect certain high quality habitats, and maybe tweak, move, readjust certain aspects to keep that in mind. And then obviously on behalf of our clients, we need to think about how BNG will influence the project timeline, influence budget and costs, and really help understand the risks and opportunities within a site based on also what you need a statutory impact with BNG as well. Right, so I'm going to jump over again to Mentimeter and see if there's any questions now. Let's see. here. Oh, there was one. There we go. Let's see, there's one here, one of 4. And then I'll check also the other stuff. What's the opportunity for private sector to get involved in providing services to contractors and local authorities, or to provide off-site habitat banks? Debbie, is that one you want to take potentially?
So it's quite a new market, so there's lots of unknowns, but there are third-party private sector habitat banks available to help with off-site purchase of biodiversity or habitat units. When we last looked, it was about £30,000 per unit on average, but that will vary depending on what part of the country it is, what market conditions. If there's lots of demand for these private habitat bank units, then the prices will go up. And then also, as Isabella was explaining, the trading rules and the distinctiveness is a key factor, because some of these habitat banks won't be providing very high distinctiveness in terms of habitat. So there's still quite a lot to learn, in short, for these, but they are available.
Great. A second question, how does legislation consider emergency event situation when safety at the line is priority? Well, I think maybe I touched a little bit upon it. Obviously, the landscape inputs that we're providing, or the nature input that we're providing, will still have to live up to other considerations within rail, for example. When with the safety priority of it. I think because you have to put in your 30-year maintenance plan, it also will include certain aspect of understanding safety, understanding control of trees and planting, and checkups on the essential quality of it and how it may impact its surroundings. So that's one of the key points with the Biodiversity Net Gain framework, that it was crucial to have that maintenance a part of it as a whole. I hope that answered it a little bit. How would you know if the project had a BNG requirement? Are we relying on the client communicating this? Well, I guess, Debbie, you also touched upon that. I mean, actually all projects that has to go through local planning will need to have biodiversity net gain, except for permitted development. But in theory, it is the majority of all projects. I think it's only private gardens that are somewhat excluded unless they are required to go through planning as well.
Yeah, I think that basically most projects will fall under this requirement, and even I mentioned Network Rail have set their own clear commitments around no net loss, and that came into effect this last year, and then biodiversity net gain even for PDR. So this is really take the premise that it's all projects.
Yeah. You're welcome. That's great. Biodiversity seems to be unfairly calculated at point of implementation, comparing mature vegetation to newly planted. What's the relevance of 30 years mentioned during the presentation? Yes, it is true that it's unfairly calculated at that point, but it is also very true that biodiversity really only comes with time, and it comes with a mature sort of landscape. So obviously when we are destroying landscapes, in some way biodiversity net gain framework is telling us that we need to provide additional to sort of make up for that habitat that we destroyed, because it takes time for insects, wildlife, everybody to get accustomed to a new habitat and actually habitat it. So that 30 years is to, in some way, Also future safe, I would say, to look at it quite logically. If you keep it for 30 years, it will be a lot more expensive to destroy it because it will be a lot more mature. So there's obviously a strategic impact when we think about 30 years maintenance. It is with the thought and in the mind that you develop a habitat and it gets to stay there and actually provide some benefit to the space.
And I think that's the important, when the early days of the trialing and looking at BNG 10 years ago, they hadn't really introduced this legal requirement for the management plan. Wasn't clear, but you know, the legislation made it really clear, because without that, the habitat would not be resilient, it wouldn't survive, and it would therefore not be biodiversity net gain. So I think it's one to watch out for if you are going to private sector for units. You will have the legal requirement to make sure that they're going to be managing those for 30 years. So that's a bit of a challenge, but that's one to watch out for.
Great. Okay. Just to say thank you, everyone, I think, for the end of this. If I can get that back as a presentation here. That's it for us, but obviously please feel free to reach out to us. Our emails will be here and available for you to ask any follow-up questions, or even if you want more information that you might want some links for as well. But thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for joining today.
Thank you very much, everyone. We will be uploading the recording of this Lunch and Learn to YouTube, and then distributing the slides and the afterwards. Thank you very much, and please come to future RCEA events.
Thank you.